What do these classical statues, the three wise men, and the Smurfs all have in common? It's a piece of headgear that art historians have called the Phrygian cap, and it's now the mascot for the Paris 2024 Olympic Games. Most of the media coverage around the new mascot has been saying one of two things. Either that the Phrygian cap is a symbol of freedom that dates back to the French Revolution, or that it looks like a clitoris in sneakers. I think both of these takes don't do justice to a hat that has a pretty wild history. For one thing, this hat has been floating around in Middle Eastern and European art for over 3,000 years. In that time, it's gone from being a status symbol to representing marginalized groups like foreigners, freed slaves, and then becoming a symbol of revolution. By the way, some leading scholars of classical art do think that the cap was based on genitalia, just not the clitoris. Stick around for the reveal. In this video, I'll be giving you a history of the most misunderstood piece of headgear in fashion history, the Phrygian cap. What you're looking at is the original tiara. I know you're probably used to a tiara looking like something a Disney princess would wear, but in fact the original word tiara comes from ancient Persia, and it described the hat that was worn by the Persian king. This is an example of a seal which comes from around the 6th century BC, and this depicts Cyrus I wearing what we think was a tiara. This style probably dates even further back before the Persian Empire to the Assyrian Empire. This example of a carved obelisk comes from the 9th century BC, and on the right you can see the Jewish king wearing a pointed hat, bowing down to the Persian kings, Shalmaneser III, who wears a more elaborate, upright and embellished version of the cap. Originally, the Persian tiara was made from leather. Not just any leather, mind you. One scholar has argued that the Phrygian cap was made from a very particular part of the cowhide, namely from the testicles of the bull. That's right, the Phrygian cap isn't a clitoris, but rather a scrotum. You'll never look at the Smurfs the same way again. They call it the cursed land for a reason. So according to this scholar, Pipili, who proposed the theory, bulls were sacred animals, therefore the bull scrotum supposedly conferred the strength of the bull on the wearer. I don't know if I'm convinced, but I think it's an interesting theory. The scholar who proposed this argument did so based on a line in Homer which describes Agamemnon's helmet, but to really prove his point, he decided to make a reconstruction of the hat. This reconstruction used the scrotum and also the nipples of the cow as a feature to give it its distinctive shape. Can you imagine having that conversation with your butcher? Hi, I'd like to buy a bull's scrotum. Okay, sure, well, what do you need it for? I'd like to make it into a hat. So the tiara was originally a marker of high status, and according to ancient Greek author Xenophon, only the king was allowed to wear it in the upright position. Although I don't really know what the upright position means in the context of a scrotum. It was originally worn by soldiers and other high-ranking figures from Persian society, but surprisingly this magical bull scrotum hat turned out to be a massive hit, and it started spreading throughout all of the Achaemenid occupied territories in the Middle East and beyond. And this is how it started popping up in ancient Greek art. So starting from the 5th century BC, the Greeks started using the Phrygian cap to represent almost anyone who came from the East. One of the most famous examples is Paris, Prince of Troy, who famously seduced Helena of Sparta and launched a war that launched 1,000 ships. In most Greek depictions, he's shown wearing a Phrygian cap and not much else. They certainly didn't make Orlando Bloom wear that in the movies. Located in modern-day Turkey, Phrygia was home to the legendary city of Troy from Homer's Iliad. That's why so many Trojan heroes from Greek mythology are depicted wearing the Phrygian cap. Of course, this is probably not a historically accurate picture of what the Bronze Age fashions of Troy actually looked like, because we know that the earliest depictions of the tiara come from the 9th century BC, and the civilization of Troy that was depicted in the Iliad probably came from a few hundred years before that. However, the artists of classical Athens liked to use the fashions of their own day to get the point across to the average viewer. It was kind of like putting Joan of Arc in a beret or putting George Washington in a Yankees baseball cap. It wasn't necessarily historically accurate, but it was highly recognizable. That's not the only thing about the tiara that was lost in translation. Greek historian Herodotus, when he was trying to translate the word tiara into Greek, chose the ancient Greek term pilos. Now, traditionally a pilos was a cap made of wool or leather that went underneath a helmet, and it was designed to shield the head from blows and make the process of wearing a metal military helmet just a little bit more comfortable. A pilos was also associated with being a lower class working person's cap. This translation really didn't capture the majesty and grandeur of the tiara. If anything, it made the tiara seem like a sort of lower class working person's headgear as opposed to the crown that it originally was. This started to change slightly with the rise of the Roman Empire. This statue represents the spirit of Rome herself, and you might notice that on her head is a Phrygian cap. The Romans believed that their city was founded by Aeneas, one of the princes of Troy, who fled following the Trojan War. So in a sense, Rome herself had origins in the East, and this was reflected in her Phrygian cap. But that doesn't mean the Phrygian cap was completely rehabilitated. It definitely retained its earlier associations with foreigners from the East. However, the Romans were more willing to adopt Eastern religions and Eastern customs. When a new religion from Persia started to take off in the Roman Empire, the cult of Mithras, the Romans gave him a Phrygian cap to symbolize his status as a foreign god in Rome. Another Eastern religion that became quite popular in Rome, the cult of Jupiter Dolichanes, adopted a similar strategy and used the Phrygian cap to represent the fact that this god came from the East originally. The Romans also started to transform the meaning of the ancient Greek worker's hat, the pilos. This is an example of the Roman pileus. This was being given to two slaves in a ceremony known as manumission, which was the freeing of a slave. The hat became synonymous with liberty, and in Latin, to confer a pileus on someone meant to grant them their freedom, not just to give them a hat. The hat was also not just about individual freedom. It could be used to symbolize the freedom of an entire society. When Brutus and the assassins of Caesar decided to mint coinage, the iconography they chose was a pileus between two daggers. The message is quite clear. Through the act of regicide of killing Julius Caesar, Rome has been freed from tyranny. The Phrygian cap survived longer than the Roman Empire itself, and in the medieval period it continued to represent people who came from the East. This is an early Christian depiction of the Nativity, and you may notice the three wise men wearing three bright red Phrygian caps. This mosaic comes from the Basilica di Santa Pollinara in Ravenna and was made in the year 526 AD. After all, the three wise men vaguely come from the East, so you may as well slap a cap on them. The hat also became a popular way of representing Jewish figures in biblical stories. Take for example this ivory carving which represents Daniel in the lion's den and comes from Syria in the 6th century AD. In the late antique to early medieval period, pointed hats of a slightly different kind became the height of fashion across the Middle East and Europe. Initially, a pointed hat called the Qalansuwa became popular in the court of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur around the years 754 AD to 775 AD. During this time, the Qalansuwa became quite large and ornate. After all, the bigger and more ornate your Qalansuwa, the more wealthy and important you were. This fashion trend travelled all the way along the Silk Road, reaching as far as China in the east. Take for example these figurines of merchants wearing a Qalansuwa discovered in tombs from the 8th century Tang dynasty. These hats also spread further west. If you've ever wondered why Catholic priests wear these big pointy ornate hats, well, this is the period when the trend really started to take off. Initially, the trendsetters were European aristocracy and priests. However, very soon, Pope Leo IX decreed that these hats were the official uniform of all Catholic archbishops in the year 1049 AD. At this point in time, the hat seemed to be a positive thing. After all, it represented all the wealth and opulence of the East, and therefore was something of a status symbol. However, this was all about to change around the time of the First Crusade in the year 1056 AD. Following the First Crusade, Europeans started to reject any article of clothing that had an association with the East, including the pointed hat, which at that point had become associated with Judaism and therefore became a target for anti-Semitism. Take for example depictions of the condemnation of Christ on the doors of the Verona Cathedral from 1154 AD, which feature caricatures of Jewish people wearing pointed hats. Not wanting to be confused with these Jewish stereotypes, Catholic bishops quickly changed their uniform, mandating that they wore hats with 2 points, not 1. Over the next 200 years, various European cities passed laws requiring that Jewish people wear pointed hats to differentiate them. These hats, it seems, were not a positive thing, as there were other laws mandating that the pointed hat be worn by criminals, heretics, and women who had relationships with Jewish men. Hats representing outsiders could have very dire consequences. These pointed hats also started to show up in a more unexpected place, namely in fairy tales. Have you ever noticed that a lot of different fairy tale characters tend to wear pointed hats, from wizards to dwarves, elves, and sometimes even ogres? This trend started in the 15th century when many of the fairy tale creatures we know and love today were originally created. Art historian Naomi Lubrich has argued that these were influenced by Jewish stereotypes. For example, in Brothers Grimm fairy tales, the characters wearing pointy hats were generally associated with being tricky or deceptive. You'll never look at the Smurfs the same way again. Let's skip ahead to the world of 18th century fashion. All of a sudden, the Middle Ages is out and classical Rome is back in. Young upstart America is starting to break free from the influence of Britain, and along with it, it starts looking for symbols that represent the new state. Or more accurately, they start looking for ancient fashions. Who better to represent American independence than the ancient Roman goddess of freedom herself, complete with the pileus? In this painting from 1790, you can see the Phrygian cap has become more than just the face of America's freedom from Britain. You can see liberty in the foreground, but she's not just liberty, she is the genius or spirit of America. In the background are African people wearing liberty caps. So here, the Phrygian cap represents not just American independence, but also the abolition movement. Some scholars have argued that this initially American trend soon spread to France, and they adopted it as a symbol of their own revolutionary movement. The liberty cap became the chosen headgear of France's very own liberty goddess Marianne, and of the Jacobin revolutionaries. So, what do we make of the Phrygian cap? Well, here are some final thoughts. What I find interesting about the Phrygian cap is the way it undergoes these dramatic transformations from being a status symbol to being marginalized. I think one of the reasons for this is that the Phrygian cap is a bit of a barometer for the relationship between the Middle East and Western Europe. At times when Eastern powers were thriving and were the center of culture, fashion, and wealth, European powers tried to emulate those fashions, such as during the medieval period. However, during times of rivalry and conflict with the Middle East, such as the Persian Wars in ancient Athens and during the Crusades in medieval Europe, all of a sudden anything associated with the East becomes stigmatized. And so it's no coincidence that during these periods, the Phrygian cap becomes stigmatized, it becomes a symbol of the other, and is sometimes used to actively persecute people who come from the East. The cap also has an interesting relationship with class. It went from being a status symbol in Persia to being a working class hat in ancient Greece, and a symbol of freed slaves in ancient Rome. What I find most interesting is the way that people in power sometimes then actively appropriate this symbol of marginalization and make it into a symbol of the state. As happened when the Romans claimed to be descended from a fleeing prince from ancient Troy, and during the French and American revolutions, when the revolutionaries eventually become the state, and therefore the symbol of revolution becomes appropriated to the state. I think states sometimes like to represent themselves as the underdog. They like to throw back to a time when there was this major existential threat that forced people to unify in order to fight it off. And they keep throwing back to that to justify their power, even when that fight is no longer a going concern. All these highs and lows reflect the fact that fashion items are an inherently unstable way of representing meaning. I think what happens is that clothes are really easy to replicate, either through actually wearing them or through using them in iconography, and because of that, it's really easy to appropriate and change its meaning. Not to mention the fact that sometimes the world and its politics will just change around the fashion item, therefore changing society's relationship with that item. In this day and age, hats are definitely out. The Phrygian cap, much like the sorcerer's hat or the garden gnome's hat, is just this weird relic of the ancient past that kind of exists only in either costumes or in obscure historical pieces. This is why when the new Olympic mascot was revealed, it was met with confusion and skepticism as opposed to recognition. Rather than sending a clear message about equality and fraternity and freedom, the hat really just represents an overgrown clitoris. And frankly, maybe that's fitting for a hat that started life as a bull scrotum. The Phrygian cap has a highly checkered history, to say the least. So I think it's completely fair that the hat is getting some of the skepticism that it is right now. I hope that armed with better knowledge about the Phrygian cap and its history, we can start to have better conversations about the hat itself and states that use it claiming to represent freedom.